Hello. Talk winning minds of young Americans. Let's discuss. Welcome to the Forge and Anvil podcast, where we embrace uncomfortable conversations about culture and politics to sharpen ourselves for the race set before us. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. And if you would like to support the show, you can go to forgeandanvil.locals.com. Again, it's forgeandanvil.locals.com. Joining us today, we have our guest, Matt Hull. Matt, feel free to introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Matt. I currently work in hospice. I do marketing. My background, my bachelor's degree is from Purdue University in communication. I then went to seminary where I received my master's in divinity, did some times in missions work, have done some extensive counseling training and training of people to be counselors. And then, of course, a lot of emphasis in youth ministry, preaching and teaching.
Awesome. And of course, joining us as always is co-host Zach Aval. Zach, feel free to say hi.
Hey, it's your pal Zach, singer-songwriter, guitar player extraordinaire. Zach of All Music on the Instagram, Zach of All on YouTube. Just did a video teaching music by using horror movie theme songs. So check that out.
Awesome. Alrighty, well, we're going to dive straight into our story. So this is from the New York Post. How TikTok has become a dangerous breeding ground for mental disorders. A new group of social media stars are surging on TikTok, mental health influencers. Most of them are teen girls and young women who post videos of themselves experiencing symptoms like Tourette's, tics, or rapid switches from one personality to another due to borderline personality disorder. Others, often without any medical credentials, post videos that help viewers self-diagnose their own mental conditions. These videos are getting billions of views on TikTok alone. The hashtag BPD, borderline personality disorder, has 3.7 billion views. Hashtag bipolar, 2 billion. And hashtag DID, dissociative identity disorder, another 1.5 billion. Recently, psychologists have noticed a wave of adolescent girls also claiming to suffer from Tourette syndrome and rare mental health conditions such as borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia, conditions not typically seen in the teen demographic. And a common denominator between many of these symptomatic girls has been identified: consuming mental health content on TikTok. After nearly 2 years of lockdowns and school closures, lonely teens are spending more time online, and many inevitably come across mental health content on TikTok. When they do, the platform's algorithm kicks in, serving suggestible young girls even more videos on the topic. While mental health awareness is surely a good thing, well-meaning influencers are inadvertently harming young, impressionable viewers, many of whom seem to be incorrectly self-diagnosing with disorders or subtly manifesting symptoms because they are now aware of them. So, Matt, we'll go ahead and start with you. But after going through that article, what are your initial thoughts?
Yeah, I think the first thing I think about is just how easily it is to influence someone when it's on a mass platform, whether it's social media or some kind of news outlet. When I first went to college, I actually was studying to be in newspaper media, and we actually had an ethics class that described what would you do in a situation where a well-known public figure committed suicide. And they said the reason why we ask is because there's actually research that shows substantially more people will commit suicide in the exact same way when that information becomes public. So, there are people, of course, that I think have issues and struggles, but then I think there is some, if you want to say copycat, there's some ways that people I think are seen by that, influenced by that, and replicate it, whether it's actually intentional or subconscious. I'm not sure, but I think it does influence people just when they have that mass produced idea that this is something normative.
Yeah. Zach, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, it speaks to a lot. I mean, I know that TikTok is kind of one of the more popular ones, but before that, uh, maybe not more than a few years ago, it was Instagram, where that was giving specifically young women. Um, they were developing body dysmorphia and things like that, and dealing with anorexia and believe me, and horrible things. Um, And so I think, to Matt's point, it is something to do with just the platform that people choose to be on, and the content that the algorithms and things like that feed them. I mean, it was a little disturbing to read about specifically here with TikTok, um, these mental health influencers there, claiming to have, and be, I would hope that it's, a misunderstanding of what's their own mental health rather than them purposely, portraying these characteristics or negative side effects of some of these illnesses and things like that. I do think that's also something that is somewhat prevalent, and that I've been noticing the last couple of years is people um, diagnosing themselves incorrectly, or noticing that there's something off about their behavior, let's say, and then rather than going and seeing a qualified mental health professional, they're going to TikTok, Facebook, things like that for their information, rather than consulting with qualified health professionals.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And Matt, I know you have a lot more of actual academic background within counseling, whereas Zach and I are just two guys on the internet. But maybe you could speak a little bit to some of your experience and what actual academics behind some of the counseling looks like. And I mean, are you concerned when you hear these trends of individuals going and getting advice from influencers on social media?
Oh yeah, I mean it's always concerning when you realize that most of the people's education is simply just exposure. So they feel that because they have some kind of contact with it, that they've been educated and then now are educators. And so there's just a danger in that of, misusing a tool. For instance, if you had a construction worker that just one day decided he wanted to be a crane operator because he'd seen it been worked, you cause huge panic and problems and issues just because they make assumptions, they attempt, and then it just shows there's so much consequence. I think the real ramification comes when these people are saying they have these disorders, and you have psychologists or clinical people that just based off of self diagnosis affirm what they have come to believe. And when I was actually in seminary, we had a counseling training class with several, I mean, PhD, MDs, ODs, doctorates or just all kinds of different doctorates that practice medicine. And they'd done it for 30 or 40 years. And so they would talk about, we have the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Psychology now. It's the fifth version, but they would talk about first, second, and third versions. And so they said, as young people doing our clinicals, we were talking about diagnosing somebody with depression or multiple personality disorder. And, they just basically one day walked us through a psych ward and told us what it was and said, well, now you're qualified to diagnose. Here's a book. And if you read it and you can make some good ascertain, you can basically make a guess that this is what it is. And then, of course, psychology was brought in after that. So I think it's not an exact science. I think that's always the hard thing with psychology is it's not precise. It is a lot based on observations. I mean, the three of us right now, if we looked at a painting, we'd have completely different observations. And so you look at a person who's far more complex than a painting, and it gets very difficult.
Yeah. And now, obviously, we've been hearing a lot that social media has led to a rise in mental health disorders, and this article obviously spoke a lot to that. How much of this do you think is legitimate health disorders as opposed to kids just wanting to fit in, or maybe people jumping the gun on giving themselves some self-diagnosis? What's your take on that?
I think it could go both ways. Again, that's where it's so difficult. You get the mixed in of people who can walk the same walk, but deep in their hearts, it's not necessarily something they're actually struggling with. It's just something that I think has almost been glorified. I mean, if you think about like DID, dissociative identity disorder, Fight Club in the late '90s, early 2000s, where it was insomnia and mental disorder was almost intriguing, entertaining. And you have Moon Knight now, a superhero who also has multiple personalities, but they're all used for good. Whereas in real life, if you see people who actually struggle with this, it is so damaging. It is so painful, so difficult. They're not effective members of society that could build these huge empires or stop major problems from happening. they're just completely aloof. They're completely outside of reality. So I think one of the things is if you see these people that are doing well, they're able to hold a job, they're able to, have good relationships, they're probably not actually struggling from the mental disorders, depending upon, of course, what the mental disorder is that they're claiming.
Yeah. Yeah. And I I noticed another theme as well between both the article as well as what Zach said from his own anecdotal experience. But the article did primarily focus in on teenage girls, especially. So I am curious, Matt, because I would be inclined to believe that this is something that can affect men as well. But do you feel like there is a separation between the female mind and the male mind with who's more susceptible? Or are we just, do we have different weaknesses? What's your take on some of that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it would go back to Genesis and talk about, how God created man and woman very differently. Man has a different role than woman, and I think that it's easy to talk about those different roles and assume that one is superior or inferior based upon what role they play, which I think is just an absolute ridiculous observation. It's not true at all. Both are absolutely necessary. Both have certain things that are vital to the other person surviving and thriving. And so I think that the female, of course, was designed to be more led, to be led by the male. And that does not mean that she does not have leadership capabilities. That does not mean that she has lack of intelligence. I think it's just a way that God designed for that complementary role to function. Some men obviously are a little bit more secondary. They don't want to take a leading role. They don't want to be the person who's up front making all the decisions. That doesn't mean that he's feminine. That just means that he has a different desire and a different stimulus for encouraging or being rewarded to take those kinds of steps. I think as a culture, we really have kind of given women rewards for being led. And so that I think plays a lot into when they're teens, they've been led, they've been guided, they've been told they need to be protected. I think in some ways they've been sheltered. And so they've been given protection from having to be influenced and struggle with that influence. Whereas, boys are more trained to do what you're supposed to do, be a man, stand up, fight back. Women are not really trained to fight back as much. And I think that this is one of those mental battlegrounds where they need to fight back. They need to have a strong sense of who they are and what their role is in culture. And I think the struggle is they've been looking for that their whole life. God has given it in the Bible and given them direction, but then the world has so many options and so many counter ideas. And I think mental health is just one of the new ones. When I grew up, it was being a Victoria's Secret model and having a completely unnatural body type that now, of course, women are completely fighting against.
Hmm. Hmm. So you think it's maybe just a different vice for a different generation?
Yeah. I don't think there's really anything new under the sun. I think for men, we have the same things. We're taught that we should be successful. And so then, of course, when we're taught to be successful a certain way, like go to college and be a good boy, and if you obey, you'll get a promotion and get into the next step. But then we realize, somebody else can do it completely differently, and they're actually making even far more money. And so then we change directions. We go to something new. So it's all, I think, again, we learn from reward a lot. We really do learn from what we want and how to get it. And then, of course, there's also consequences, what keeps us from the thing that we want.
Yeah. Yeah. And Zach, I know you had, I believe you may have had some thoughts regarding Matt's comment about women being insulated. You seem to have an intrigued look upon your face. So I wanted to give you a chance to respond to that if you had something.
Sure. Yeah, it's something I hadn't quite considered from that angle, but it makes sense. I mean, for sure, I think there is men and women are susceptible to pressures and things like that on social media. The pressures are different, and he outlines some of those there. But yeah, I mean, there is, and I don't think it's unique to just women and young girls. I think there is this sort of um, I guess, inaccurate well-being experience repressed upon lots of people from different backgrounds, where they're either seen as somebody that needs to be protected, or as a victim. And I don't think, or at least from what I've read and seen, the socioeconomic and historical information doesn't seem to line up with a lot of that. So it's very interesting to me to see that kind of play out.
Line up with what specifically?
So, for example, not to get too far off topic, but I think about how specifically the Black community during, with these protests and things and over police violence and things like that, where they're taught almost from birth that they're the victim, and that they're and in some cases there's a lot of truth to that, but by no means is that always the case every single time, and that you do have you have um, you do have agency. You can break out of that mold. I think the world of today is a lot different than the world of our parents' generation. That's all I mean to say. So the pressures are different, yes, but solutions to past problems are also present with us as well. Does that make a little bit more sense?
Yeah, I think I understand what
Okay.
you're driving at. Um, I mean, Matt, do you feel like we have like a culture that really encourages wanting to play the victim?
Well, I think as humans, we have an innate desire to create a reality around ourselves that we want to create. And, as a kid, you do that, and you realize through just practice that doesn't work. This reality is actually a fantasy. I can't jump off of here and actually fly. I can't lift up mom's car and be Superman. Like, I have to face the reality that that's not going to be true. But I think in when we first decided that we wanted to go against God's reality, when we wanted to do our own thing, we wanted to create our own reality, we became so deluded that we just couldn't give up on it. Our pride would not let us say that this isn't right. And so I think you have to come to some kind of way of explaining away why your reality doesn't work. If this is not a fantasy, I believe that this is real. So I have to come to some explanation to basically make me understand and accept why I feel the way I do. And so I think everyone's different. You have people who are angry about it. They fight. They're saying everybody's my enemy. Everybody's against me. When you look at it, and they've had so many people that have tried to help them, so many people try to support them. Or you look at the people, of course, who are victimized. They feel that I'm a victim. Everything's not my fault. Everything's been done to me. But then you see, like, well, no, you have so many opportunities to take control, to do something, to actually act out. And so, if you're a victim, you don't have that. You don't have the ability to speak up. Your voice is not heard. I think of like Tamar, the rape of Tamar, where the brother who, of course, avenged her and murdered all these men, basically shut her up and told her to go away and we're never going to hear from her again. And literally, that's the end of her story. She is completely victimized, completely isolated, and completely voiceless. So I think that we feel that way because our reality doesn't match up with the fantasy that we want it to be.
So, that I think that there's going to be people that listen to this podcast and they might see maybe that we're driving at the idea of pulling yourself up from your bootstraps. And I think that there are people that would say that that's unhealthy. There are people that would say that that's exactly the remedy that we need in today's culture. So Matt, how would you what would you say is a healthy balance of recognizing when traumatic things have maybe happened to you, but as well as recognizing when it is time to sort of take some of that agency into your own hands?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think the Bible's ripe with the idea that pull it up by your bootstraps only works when you have done something wrong and you have the ability to repent. Like for Job, for instance, that's what his friends were telling him constantly. Job, you're doing everything wrong. If you just try harder, if you're just less dumb, then your life would be so much better. They didn't have a category for innocent suffering. And that's really what people want to understand is, I can't pick myself up by my bootstraps when I had so much trauma as a child. And I think that's where you have to have a category for innocent suffering and you have to help people work through trauma. But then, of course, you do have the people who there is no trauma, there is no struggle. It is literally just they don't have what they want, and they thought if I could whine and complain enough, then I could get it. And those are the people you say you can repent, you can actually change. You can pick yourself up by your bootstraps. But through all that, you still have to recognize I'm still a sinner stuck in my own sin, and I'm dead to do anything. And so I need help. I need something to give me life and give me motivation to change. And that's not going to be will. That's not going to be motivation that comes from self. I mean, that has to be literally just from the Spirit. So it's complex. I think each individual is sometimes a mixture of all of those things, and it's easy to try to boil it down into like an archetype. But nobody's an archetype. There's no such thing as a person who's an archetype. We're all complex memories of history, struggle, success. And so I think really just getting to know a person, loving them, I mean, that's really what I think people need most.
Yeah, that's good. And when it comes to, you've been weaving in and out different biblical narratives into our conversation. I think that psychology is an interesting field when it comes to mixing psychology with theology or even just the church at large. And obviously, you're someone that has a background in both. So I'm curious, what do you think is the healthy relationship between psychology and a believer, as well as the relationship between psychology and how it's used in the church?
Oh yeah, I don't think they should be enemies. I don't think that somebody should say, which I've heard, that everything's a spiritual issue. There's no such thing as a physical struggle. It's the mental stuff is just spiritual, demonic, some kind of thought that you need to repent of. I think there are literal physical issues that science has proven cause a harder understanding of your reality. And so if you deny that, if you completely ignore that, you're not meeting the need that God has actually presented. And I think that comes from pride, that comes from just, that's how I want it to be. On the opposite side, of course, you have, scripture has its place, which is the spiritual, but then psychology is, of course, superior when it comes to mind and understanding how the brain functions. I think that's taken a step too far. That's where you get into like evolution, the scientific, what people would say is fact of evolution, where statistically you'd see it's actually an impossibility. It's a theory for a reason. And that's because statistically evolution has zero chance of actually working simply based on mathematics. So you kind of have those back and forth fighting. But I think a lot of the health changes, health improvements, health great things have been in the past 200 years have sometimes come from science going against the church giving the science the freedom to explore and learn. And for me, I think the more that science explores God's creation, the more beauty, the more awesomeness they're going to find. But then, of course, how we use those things has to be looked through a biblical lens.
Yeah. Yeah. So would you say that you view psychology as just one of many tools that, say, a pastor can try to acquire to put in his tool belt to better minister to his flock?
Yeah, I'd say it's something, for instance, cocaine used to be something used for headaches. Not the best medication that I would take right now if I had a headache, but obviously it had some kind of utility. The same thing with psychology. I think there's some things that may look like they're helping now, but they may actually be more problematic than helpful, and so you just have to be careful. So I wouldn't say avoid it. I wouldn't say demonize it for sure, but I wouldn't say accept everything. Be very critical. Be very careful, and definitely don't trample on anybody that's had help from it. I think that's one thing too that biblical counseling has a bad reputation of, which isn't true. That we just don't want to accept that psychology could help somebody. I think there are things that God gives common grace to everybody, and He gives the ability to help. And sometimes you should just be thankful for that and encourage that, rather than say, well, if that didn't come from me, then that wasn't good enough.
What would you say would be an example of psychology being used in an unhealthy way?
I think, honestly, I could get a lot of flack for this one, so you're really giving me a good question for this. I really think that the idea of introvert and extrovert are too simple. I think it's something that has been believed and accepted for a long time, that I get energy from being introverted, from being by myself, or I get energy from being extroverted by being around people. I think that's really boiling people down into two separate categories when, I would call myself extremely introverted. Like, I wanted to live in Alaska and be a trapper and be in the city like 3 days out of the year. Like, that's what my goal in life was. But now, being around people and helping them, that gives me energy. So naturally, I'm an introvert, but then I've seen the beauty of being an extrovert, and so now I feel like I'm stuck. Like, I don't know which one I am. And I think it comes down to, if I'm introverted, I have more of a selfish tendency of fear of judgment of other people judging me. Whereas if I'm extroverted, I have a selfish need for other people to approve of me. And so I'm just longing for that approval. But like I said, I think that could be something that so people would be happy to disagree with me on, and I would not fault them for it.
Yeah. And Zach, you looked like you maybe had some issue with that. So I'd love for you to respond to that. And
yeah, I mean,
feel free to
I
dialogue.
sure. Yeah, I mean, I hadn't quite ever heard that challenge, so it's a new thing to consider. But I definitely think that there is something to be said for that, right? Because there are lots of people like Matt who don't really feel like they're introverted or extroverted. I mean, it is something though that you can test for. I did do a personality test, and it turns out I am extroverted, but not as extroverted as I think I am. So, I mean, there are things like that, and even just within those categories, there's a broad spectrum there as well. So nobody's ever, to Matt's point, I don't think anybody is ever like 100% extroverted or 100% introverted. I think if those people do exist, they're pretty hard to find for a reason. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely something to be said for that, and you can also throughout the course of your life shift, from one end of the spectrum to the other. I've known many people that were introverted that kind of learned how to, I guess, for lack of a better term, and not to disrespect those people, but they learned how to play well with other people. As somebody once said, you can choose to die alone, but you live amongst men, or something like that. So everybody, needs friends and things like that. Everybody, we're designed to be in relationship with each other. That's how God designed us.
Yeah.
I think that we agreed in concept, and our terms are what make us uncomfortable. Because I feel like exactly what you said, I agree 100% with, which is that there is a spectrum. And I think as soon as I tell someone, oh, you're extroverted, then it locks them into that in their mind, and it gives them a label. And it's almost like I've defined a part of their identity. But like you just said, throughout life, that changes. And so something that's part of my identity shouldn't change. It shouldn't be flexible. It should be pretty solid.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many things that I want to pick your brain about, Matt. But I do want to go back a little bit to our to the article. Have you noticed, as someone who has provided counseling services, have you noticed in an increase specifically with TikTok as opposed to other social media platforms with the rise of these mental disorders that are being reported?
Yeah, I don't know if I would say that I have witnessed it firsthand in the counseling room. I would see that it has become far more of an issue that needs to be talked about and has conferences on and books written about. And I think to me, that really says that there's a movement happening, and there's a counter movement that's responding. And so I can't say that I've seen a lot of it, but from peers and other people, of course, who are in the trenches, I can see that their response is proving that is true, that there is just so much push for identity and who am I, and mental disorders being just common, just being very normative for people.
Yeah. And I know something that I've been noticing a theme on, not so much a theme, more of an unsettling trend, is that the suicide rates for men is significantly higher than women. So even though we've talked thus far about some of the, the article was going on a lot about how there's a lot of young women that are falling victim to maybe some unhealthy trends in mental health due to TikTok or just social media and culture in general. But there's obviously some missing gaps here when it comes to the mental health of young men, and we have a lot of young men listeners. So I'm curious, Matt, if you see any gaping holes in terms of like our care both whether that be the church or whether that be social programs, whatever the case may be. And what can people do to kind of mitigate some of these horrible tragedies?
Yeah, I think a lot of times you see statistically that men do commit suicide at a pretty more alarming rate than females do. And especially when a man makes a comment about it, it should be taken a little bit more seriously, because it actually does have a higher rate of actual coming to fruition. What I see, I think, mostly for men is, our purpose really is in being valuable. And I think that value as a person is so often tied in our culture to utility. Like, what can I do? What am I able to provide for the culture? Or what am I able to provide for family or for friends or for my work? And I think when that happens, and people are fighting, we're really encouraged to go against each other. Almost when you meet somebody, your first question is, what do you do? And you're almost sizing them up, unconsciously. I think we're trying to figure out, like, am I better than you? Do you make more money than me? Are you, and then you start to compare yourself and say, well, am I valuable? Do I actually have a purpose here? Because, like, maybe you're 10 years younger than me, but your job is really important compared to mine, and your family is doing really well, and your kids behave really well. Like, and so you start to doubt your value. And so I think men really do start to fear that they're not valuable. And then that, of course, leads to self-reflection. You start to have these fears that people are thinking all these terrible things about you. But I always go back every time I've ever counseled somebody through depression, and I feel men really struggle with depression more than women, just from my own experience. The thing I always go back to is, literally in Colossians, it says that the entire world, universe, everything is held together by the will of God. And so at any second, if God did not want something to exist, it would not exist. And so I'll tell people, literally right now, God thinks you're worth his energy. The God who's created all of everything, he thinks you are worth his energy to exist. And that's what makes you valuable. Not what you can do, not what you have done, not what you will do, but literally the God he could create anything he wanted. He created you and he wants you to exist. So I think people just need to hear that more often. They just need to hear that the value doesn't come from what they can contribute. It just comes from the fact that they exist, and God is an amazing God.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the idea of purpose, I think, is still a huge driving factor for men, especially. And I know I'm speaking to this, personally as well from my own experience. And I think where, for me, I felt a struggle, and so I'm speaking, assuming that there's many men that feel the same way, is feeling a piece of of my identity in Christ, but then also feeling like, okay, but now how do I apply this? And I think that still tends to be a struggle for men in terms of that, going back to that idea of purpose. So how would you speak into that a little bit more, in specifics, just because I think that there's probably going to be men that listen to this podcast that feel like they're believers, their faith is strong, but they just don't know what to do. And so they still feel like they are maybe stuck in this fog of not feeling like they're contributing. So what would be some practical steps to maybe start to mitigate some of that?
Yeah, I think when you go to practical steps, of course, when you're talking to a pretty diverse audience, you really do have to get principled. And so principled for me, of course, God created all things to glorify himself. 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether you eat or drink, do all things to the glory of God. So literally everything you should do should be thought, how can this give glory and honor to God? And so part of it is, God's a logical God. I love telling people, like, God created math and engineering. So, like, he actually does have logic. It's not all mystic. Nobody understands. There is some mystery, but God's very logical. And so God doesn't expect you to do things that you can't do. That would be unfair. That would be cruel. So God has given you the abilities that you need to meet the needs around you. And so that may not mean that you can meet all the needs, which is why you are in a culture, in a community, in a very diverse body of people. And so you just figure out, how can I glorify God and meet the needs of those around me? And that is who you are. So, like, when I became a Christian, I basically said, I want to clean toilets because that's all I'm good to do. I've done too many bad things. I can't figure this out. Basically, God's like, well, you're going to go to seminary. I was like, I don't want to do that. I go to seminary, figure out this has actually been amazing. It's really helpful. He says, okay, do missions. I'm like, that's the one thing I don't want to do is missions. So I was like, fine, I'll go do missions, whatever. Okay. Like, all right, I just want to go back to Tennessee. That's where I want to minister to the people who have heard the gospel but don't know the gospel. He's like, go to Washington State. Go get out of there. You're not getting anywhere near that. So I said, okay, God, I'm going to die here. I'm going to serve these people. He goes, okay, move to Tennessee. So needless to say, there's never been a point in my life where I said, this is what I wanted to do. But I've also never had a point in my life where I said, I wish I'd never done this. And all that comes from, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing practically daily, except whatever I can to glorify God and help my fellow man. And so I think it comes down to, I need to be who other people need me to be. If that means I need to be, kind and nice, or that means I need to be a little strict, a little bit more forceful, or if it means I need to be patient, if it means I need to be a little more convicting, confrontational. That's the hard part of Christian life, is learning how to use words that are gracious to those who are going to hear. So I can't give a specifically practical advice individually, except just explore ways that you can express your glorification of God through your personality that helps other people. That's the simplest way I could probably put it.
Yeah, that's well put. And we do live in a culture that is getting increasingly hectic. It would be a word that I could use. And there are individuals who are very aware of things going on in the news cycle. I think it's really hard not to be somewhat affected by it, whether that be immediate or just the ripple effect. So what would be some steps that people could take to make sure that they are well off in terms of their mental health? What kind of maybe whether that be daily or weekly routines that you think that a person should try to hold to be in good mental standing? If you can just give us some of your insight on that.
Oh yeah, I think the two things that I would say every man of Christ should do, and really every woman too, of course, but I'm speaking to men because that's my specialty, because that's the way God created me, is one, you should find a day of rest. And really, it's as best you can, take a time where you're not looking at the news cycle, you're not looking at the stock market, or glued to your phone for whatever emails you expect, or but spend time with your family. It's not just a day of rest, meaning I completely blank out and veg over. Like, I literally just spend time with people. I just enjoy the people that I'm with. I fellowship with them. I spend time with them. It doesn't even have to be directional. Like, it's not like it's going to be a time where you say, well, we're going to sit down, we're going to study and read. It's really just spend time with people. Just sit there and enjoy the time with people. And the second thing, and I always forget the verse reference, which, bad pastor of me. But there's a proverb that says, a man who hides his transgressions will not prosper. And so the second thing I would say is find a group of men that you are vulnerable with. Literally, you talk about who you are, your fears, your sins. And I think that's so core to us as men, that we need somebody else just to say, you know what, you're not weird. Your sin and your own identity, everything about you is not abnormal. You're not out there to where you're just alone. You're like, I get that too. Like, I struggle with that too. Maybe not that exact way, but I struggle too. I have a hard time with that. And just hearing other people say, your sin's normal. Your sin is common to man. And I think that's 1 Corinthians 10:13. There's no sin that's not common to man. But just some encouragement, some good, vulnerable, transparent fellowship.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, we're running low on time, but we really appreciate you giving some of those practical bits of advice, because I definitely think that mental health is something that should be taken very seriously. And I think it's always good to have a chance to do a self-evaluation and make sure that you've got some tools that some ideas you can implement to, make sure that you are doing well so that you can serve the kingdom well. So really appreciate you joining us, Matt, and giving your thoughts on that. I don't know if you have any social media or anything that you might want to shout out, but feel free to do so. You can let people know where they can find you.
I mean, I've got 3 kids, so if you want to get on my social media and see my family, you're more welcome to do that. I'm not a huge social media person. My online presence is pretty low, but I appreciate the opportunity. And if, of course, you want to look me up on Facebook or anything, I'm happy to message, and just thankful to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. And Zach, where can people find you?
You can find me on the Intergoogles at Zach of All Music on the Instagram. That's where I'm most active. If you want to see what I'm up to day to day, creating music, teaching music, and things like that. YouTube is going to be a lot of the fruition of that. I just did a video teaching some music concepts using some of my favorite horror movie themes. Beyond that, I've got an album coming out here Friday, the 14th of October, The Way We Were. It's a nice stripped down acoustic album. It's the most vulnerable I've ever been in the recorded format, so I hope you check it out.
Awesome. There we go, guys. Zach's being vulnerable. We're taking these concepts and we're applying them. So awesome. Well, thanks so much for listening, everyone. This has been the Forge and Anvil podcast. If you want to support the show, you can go to forgeandanvil.locals.com. Thank you so much for listening.